So I just want to thank you guys for taking the time to meet with us today. I know it's summer and I know it's a beautiful day out there, but it means a lot for us to have Abe visiting us to chat with Dorian, a recent grad from Montserrat. So Abe Tena is a Mexican-born illustrator, game designer, artist, and educator working in Boston and a current faculty at Mass Art. And he spent the last 5 years as a game designer and artist for Popotropica. Did I say that right?
Popotropica, yes.
Popotropica. Which is a popular online virtual world for kids. And he's here in conversation with Dorian Eason, who's also an animator, game maker, and storyteller. Again, a recent 2020 grad from Montserrat, raised in rural New Hampshire, whose interest is crafting complex worlds and narratives that inspire and engage self-reflection from a place of comfort and safety, followed closely by learning more about what causes people's varied responses. And we're actually here today thanks in part to a grant by the LDFA, which is the Learning Disabilities Foundation, which is a public charity dedicated to providing funds for research and education and the promotion of public awareness for both children and adults with learning disabilities. Dorian, do you want to kind of give us an overview of the project that you and Anya worked on? Just an overview, please.
Sure. So we were working to basically make a game geared at self-advocacy. That is sort of what Meg was focused on and what we found most interesting. And so in that interest, we learned a little bit about sort of the 4 major learning disabilities, specifically being ADHD, ADD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, and slow processing disorders. And then we sort of took that information and thinking about how we have and how our peers have had experiences at college in relation to both those learning disabilities and other disabilities, tried to design sort of 4 days, one for a character with each of these learning disabilities, and them engaging with campus resources and different struggles or challenges they might face. So this first one specifically is geared at how a student with disabilities coming into the school would get the accommodations they need in terms of communicating with Meg and paperwork, but also in terms of when they choose to share with their teachers, if they choose to share with peers, and what their choices are within that.
Fantastic. That is a great review and overview, and it really helps me kind of start thinking about the goals and the outcomes and the challenges, because I think that's something that I will have a hard time designing, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but I mean that you're set a great challenge for yourself and for your team. It's a complex issue, and I'm glad that you guys are talking about it. Certainly needed.
It really did help too that I was a resident assistant for the past 2 years, so for me it was going back to some of the different things that students had come to me about in terms of disabilities, as far as miscommunication with teachers or uncertainty about certain assignments, and how they could then access those resources. That already having that background and sort of connecting people with resources really did benefit me in being able to then put together okay, what are the resources people should really be being informed of.
Absolutely. So this kind of starts, what you're setting up here kind of leads me to some of the questions that I have, and I think at the core of it, speaking for the game design component, we can talk a little more broadly about the whole project. But in game design specifically, the question that I had asked, that I sent earlier, is this question of rewards. How do you reward your players? How do you make them feel like they're winning or whatever? And winning and losing is a little bit of an outdated term for game design, but it can be a useful framework. And so to that end, I detected a few kind of very key moments in which I got one of those soft rewards, or I was prompted or motivated to move forward and explore certain ideas. But if you could, on your own terms and based on your goals, what are, in your opinion, the things that you wanted your players to be rewarded for? Either whether it's a soft reward or a quote unquote hard reward. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the 2 main things that looking at that question came to mind are that our first goal with this was sort of the education side of we wanted people to understand both what they can do, how how they can do it in terms of things when they disclose and what they need to do, but little things like in the conversation with Meg that Twiggy has on sort of that first day learning about things, there's this point where Meg gets to say like, hey, like, if you don't want to, you don't have to tell your teachers and you're not required to. And like the understanding of those sorts of things are really important to come through. And then in terms of the world outside of that sort of main storyline, we did want to include like engagement and my sister just passed me, sorry. She's giving me a weird look. But we wanted to include a sort of like a positivity toward exploring and engaging with the other students around. Some of our plans for the days that we didn't finish did include experiences with sort of like peers maybe pushing information that they don't need and how to properly address that, but also just in terms of like having a conversation with somebody where you go up, you're like, hey, what are you up to? And they're like, oh, I'm waiting to talk to Janet, the school psychologist, because like I have weekly meetings with her.
Yeah.
Which like is that sort of, it's that borderline between like, it's that education of like, oh, the school has a psychologist and like I could go talk to them. I think that's the right word, school counselor sort of. That like I can go talk to her if I like have a sort of mental health issue that I really need help with, and she can maybe help connect me with therapists in the area, or if I'm like really homesick and missing my cats and dogs and I just want somebody to talk to for a few minutes that isn't like a peer of mine, like I want a sort of more professional outlook that's going to help me sort of decide how to help myself in the future. So it's that sort of back and forth, I guess, of education but also exploration are sort of the things that I'm trying to reward within it.
Right. So if I get this right, you will like your players to get tangible information. If this is the educational part, like tangible information as to how to conduct themselves if they do face some of these challenges in school. And then of course there is this kind of social, emotional intelligence, social component as well, right? And that's one of the things that really jumped at me and that I really enjoyed about the game, and that I wonder, now that it's here, how can it be stretched and pushed and pulled? Maybe not in this project, but in other ones. Because I found the art adorable, and not only adorable but useful in creating those little soft rewards when Twiggy is a little shy and looking to the side and feels maybe that she didn't give or that they didn't give the right answer. Sorry. That was one of those moments of stakes, right? Stakes that felt earned because I made the choice. Stakes that felt a direct either reward or detriment because of my ability or inability to pay attention and to be sensitive to the character needs and so on and so forth. And I think that's really beautiful and very powerful. And I wonder if that is something that so we have the tangible information that we want to get out of the game, right? So like where to go, what to do, how to speak, and also it's almost like a simulation. You get to try different things and see the different outcomes. But what about this emotional intelligence component? How do you see that as an important aspect of the reward and lack of reward? And do you think that is something that is at the core of your gameplay loops, or at the core of what you want your players to engage with again and again? And let me know if I'm making myself clear somewhat in my questions here.
I think so. So sort of like where they would be learning and engaging with that sort of like emotional side of like and social side of how they're making their decisions.
Yeah, is that a good? Well, as someone who is by no means expert on the subject of learning disabilities, and perhaps here is an opportunity for you to talk to me a little bit about this, and maybe we can figure out how it can become an aspect of the game. But how important do you think is for the player to inhabit that emotional space of feeling sometimes a little shy or empowered or some sort? Do you want your players to connect emotionally like that to the situation?
I definitely think so. A lot of our decisions, even we were trying not to make it this is right, that's wrong in most situations, and trying to deal a lot with where the players are coming from. I think like what was in mind was these players being people with different learning disabilities or other disabilities that might be engaging with it to understand things. So it gets to that sort of gap where like folks who don't have that engagement maybe won't have the same understanding of the game emotionally and socially. But most people, they'd be bringing sort of their own emotions from past experiences in as well. And within that, then trying to make choices where it's not completely right or wrong. So like the example that comes to mind is in Twiggy's class, in the middle of class, you can go up to the teacher and ask for a break. And the teacher will be like, oh, yeah, like, why do you need a break? And you can choose to, at that point, say, like, Twiggy, like, I have ADHD, I just really need a moment to refocus. Or you can say, like, oh, I just need some air. And either way, the teacher will let you take a break. The timing is slightly different, that if you say you have ADHD, they give you 10 minutes because they're like, oh, I think that's enough time. If you need more, let me know. If you just say like, oh, I need some air, the teacher even reacts with like a little bit of a confused expression and is like, okay, like, I guess this kid just needs a break, so like take 5 minutes, but they still let you. And it's that sort of like taking your own level of comfort as well into mind, where you're learning sort of like, if you're comfortable with it, that yes, like being more direct about this is what's going on and this is the help that I need can sort of help others help you. But at the same time, not pushing people to think that, oh, if I don't tell someone, then I'm wrong or I'm not going to get some sort of help. It's just not going to be as clearly the help that you need necessarily because the teacher doesn't understand or somebody like doesn't know what you're looking for.
Yes, excellent. I'm so glad you mentioned that because this gets us to the, I think, the core insight of your game and one of the, in my opinion, one of the kind of the sources of a lot of richness in the practice as it is now, but even more in the future and any project you have moving forward. I did explore both options when I played the game, but I did not pay attention, and this is perhaps my fault. I wasn't playing the game right? But I did not pay attention to the subtle difference between in terms of the amount of time you're given, which is completely reasonable. That sounds like a earned experience, like something you've observed and understand. As a player who is perhaps not sensitive or understands the specific codification of terms and or code of terms and the proper behaviors that you're trying to present here in the game, I missed that feedback. And this is a question, and that's fine. This is a question that is for games in general. Let me just say, we're in a moment in terms of game development and game design and the aesthetics of games where we're trying to let go of hard rewards and punishments. You know, back in the days, I was born in the 80s. So back in the day when we played games, we'll get a game over screen or we'll get, you win. And then the games were very simple. They were basically very binary. You lose, you win, you die, or you kill someone else. You know, it sounds blunt, but that was really the experience of the game, the arcades back in the 80s and 90s. And a lot of insights and a lot of the evolution of games have depended on, you know, moving away from binary solutions and moving away from reductive or essentialist ways of looking at of behavior, right? In you know, the games that I played when I was a kid, they had like one reward, one action that the game designers rewarded me for, which is, you know, defeat an enemy or something like that. And now we're living in this space, and thanks to artists like you, including, right, of course, and the space that we are trying to kind of push for, or the aesthetics that we're trying to push for in game design, where it's much more subtle than that. And we're always kind of moving in a spectrum. And this kind of connects a little bit with the issue of demographic that you raise in your own questions, right? Like, who is going to get this? Who will inhabit the space and enjoy or appreciate the soft rewards? Who needs a game over screen versus who needs that very sensitive but rather subtle difference of the portrait of the teacher? And there's no right or wrong answer about this, but it does connect with your own question about demographic and for who this game is. As a person who could not see through the subtlety beyond the emotional space or general understanding of you know, disability, learning disabilities in the classroom, I missed that important difference between the 10-minute break versus the longer break. And so my instincts will be to, as a game designer, you will have to decide, my instincts will be to create a stronger sense of feedback. It's like, you know, show me, make the color of the watch kind of show up, or add a little label that says you get 10 minutes of break, or you get 15 minutes of a break. But again, keep in mind that I come from a world that explains things in this very kind of clear way. And so it's a matter of your choice and the space you want to inhabit. What do you think about that?
So it's definitely like a very subtle difference, and I can see like, yeah, it probably is able to be missed.
And that could be, that's fine, right? That's
Yeah.
part of that's the arguments we make through our decisions. You know, I think that this is kind of perhaps kind of a personal bias of me, but although I'm a game designer, I consider myself more of a game design artist, you know, someone who makes games as a studio practice. And by that, I mean that subjectivity and personal voice is more important sometimes than the specific outcomes. And so to me, that subtlety of the feedback is not a error to fix. It would be an error if I was trying to deliver a very specific curriculum. So for example, when I used to work for Pearson, sometimes I will be, you know, a game designer working for a class in which we will teach some math, subjects. And there was a test at the end, right? And so I had to create the feedback to make sure that that was clear. Later on, I've come to appreciate how those subtleties about deciding how much feedback or not, or how strong to, or how heavy to make the emotional component or the logical component or some sort, that was not so much a detriment or a limiting aspect or an aspect of design, but more a personal choice. And so long as this comes from a kind of a place of personal truth, you understand that that subtlety and that that more light reward is true to your experience and the experience of the people that you're trying to represent and work with, then that's the right choice. You see what I'm getting at? But that's precisely the space of exploration. I often suggest my students to think about the cheesiest solution or the most clear solution, not because it's the best one, and then the most subtle solution, and consider that on the spectrum. So in the cheesiest solution, not the one to implement, but the one that is worth having in our heads, we have like a game over screen, or we get like a little sound when you make the choice that gives you 15-minute break, right? And that's way too hammy, but we have that as a little bit of an idea. And then over here, we have the most subtle thing we can possibly imagine, right? And we choose what feels right to us in that spectrum. Does that make sense to you? Am I making any sense here?
Yeah, definitely. Just sort of like thinking about how then, like from a player side, at least, it would be like how quickly maybe they can very easily, like the game over screen's very direct feedback, like you messed something up. Whereas a much more subtle thing might be more of like, as you're going on and seeing the effects of that, maybe later on, you start to be like, oh, it was that thing back there that maybe triggered this. Or even just in that moment, yeah, the like little sound effects and things that start to cue you into it, but aren't outright saying like, you messed up, but it's like, oh, like subtle changes. I don't know how to word it right now, but it is processing to my mind. So
that space in between is, to put it in terms of two extremes, seems reductive or binary, but it's a huge space of possibility. Like the world is yours to decide what does that feedback look like. And to be clear, you already do it, right? Because as I said, I responded strongly to the characterization, and by that not only I mean the character design, but also the dialogue choices. I really enjoy those little moments where Twiggy is talking to themselves, right? And this, they let their mind wander and say something, and that enriches the character. It makes them feel like they have a worldview. They're looking at the world through a very specific constructed perspective. And so it is possible to construct an entire kind of universe of choices and player feedback and that will connect us to the stakes of the game. Just to that alone, like you have the tools necessary to do this, and I experienced it to the game. So if that's the tone and the level of clarity of the of feedback, that's what it is. And in that sense, it's almost the question is almost in reverse in terms of thinking like, how can I tackle a specific demographic? Is how out of experience, my own sensitivity as an artist and designer, I can produce something that feels true, that feels real, that is the genuine answer, or the genuine product of who I am and what I think, and we will see how people react, right? Because in that sense, your own experience, it's a source of authority, it's a source of knowledge. Does this make sense to you?
Missed a little bit in the middle there, but I think I got most of it. So sort of thinking then, like, yeah, how we're bringing our own mentalities into the game, which for us, like for our team, I think helped a lot to have Meg and Blythe as resources, both on the education side, because neither of us, I would think, are really experts in it, but sort of like having that chance to ask the questions that we need to and really gain an understanding, and also having the experience as college students. I think, like, yeah, we bring that with us, that we're bringing in, like, not only the, like, oh yeah, this is what college kids go through as an idea, but like, this is what we're dealing with right now, and this is what we've heard from our friends within the last year, or this is what I was talking about with my parents last week because of XYZ. And so, like, that very direct feedback from, like, our life to, like, okay, we're talking about college, like, what are the things that stand out to us that not only we think, like, other people should understand, but also that we think maybe other people might miss, because maybe they aren't college students and they aren't looking at it from that sort of direct perspective that we might see it at. And even then acknowledging that, like, we're 2 college kids out of millions across the country, and like hundreds within the school even. So like our experiences are still going to differ from even the people that we're talking to, or the people that we don't talk to in our classes so much, that we then have to sort of account for that as well.
Well, see, and that's one of the reasons why I like those moments of characterization as well, because I think they demonstrate or make it clear that this is a subjective, lived, research, empathetic experience, but nevertheless subjective. So when Twiggy is having those mind wanderings and it goes into specific ideas that are preventing them to pay attention, that specificity is a way to say, this is not universal. This is the experience of a simulated character that is born out of the effort of many people. And quite frankly, that's one of the things that I really like about games, in particular video games, but games in general. They become like this kind of mediative object where a lot of people's experience and ideas come together, not only the people who make the games, but also the players. Which leads me to another question. How was your playtesting method, protocol? What did you do in terms of having other people play your game? Could you talk a little bit about that?
So we did mostly playtesting like within our group, just sort of the short time span made it a little bit harder for us to reach out. A lot of our playtesting was actually done by Meg, Blythe, and then like anytime I was finished basically coding a new thing or adding a bunch of dialogue, Anya would run through it as well. We like didn't that was sort of our consult on dialogue, was like we talk about, okay, like these are the conversations we want to have. I'd write some stuff and go, here, how does this look? But writing it and putting it in the game made it a little bit easier to see like what does it look like all together, where just the dialogue trees alone might just be confusing to folks. So a lot of it was like within that group then. And so it would be like each week when we'd meet, it'd be like, okay, like I've updated the file on itch.io. We actually just did a password protected one for quite a while. And then it would be like, okay, this file's updated, like we're meeting tomorrow or the next day, when I update it on time. So then like it'd be like tonight or in the morning, maybe before our meeting, if you have free time, like run through it once or twice and like see what you think, engage. Like there were a few times that it'd be like we meet for the meeting and it'd be like, oh, like this line stood out to me because it just didn't fit, or like it was a little too awkward or too forced. So like then going back and changing that, sending it back to people, seeing what they thought of the changes. So many noises around me, I'm sorry.
That's fine, that's fine. No, but I'm getting what you're saying, and this is a very exciting part then of the production of this game, of the creation of this game, because now you're opening it up to more feedback, to more people adding to the voices, and as artists and designers, you will have to hold true to what what your themes are, what are your goals, your ideals, your worldview, while at the same time kind of responding in one way or another to the feedback you receive, something that you're already probably, you're already coming out of with my questions, is this idea of like rewards and giving feedback. And then you will have to decide, whether that is actually what you need to do in response to the vision you have, that you and the team members and you have, or is something that needs to be, you need to let go of the idea of having this very crispy, to use the word, this crispy feedback, in order to protect that subtlety that is so important to the goals that you have, right? So you have to make those kind of decisions or choices, which leads me to another thing that I mentioned as my second question. And I do want to talk about this for a bit. It's connected, because it's often a misunderstood aspect of game designs and game design and narrative, especially as the way things are related, which was the idea of antagonism or antagonistic behaviors, right? Often, and I don't know if you remember the talk I gave there last year, I often talk about having antagonism or agonism in a game, but not necessarily having villains or bad people. It's an artifact of our popular culture and culture in general, I have to say, in the West in particular, that we have this understanding of the world as between good people and bad people, this kind of essentialist views of good and evil. And that we see that in popular culture and very specifically in games, especially the games I grew up with. Again, I'm gonna use a little bit of my experience, growing up with the arcades and then later on with Nintendo and all that stuff. What you always needed, quote unquote, was some villain. And I actually think that that's a problem. This is my personal opinion. I will be happy to have a conversation about that. But I think that that is too reductive. But what I do think is useful to think about is that when a character has a worldview, some sort of stable identity, that identity or worldview exists in contrast to what's around. Right? So you are who you are because you're not me, and I'm who I am because I'm not you. And that's rich and beautiful and interesting. And out of those differences, we generate a space of choices and sometimes of disagreements, sure. Sometimes that antagonism exists within. And that's one of the things that I detected a little bit in this game. Again, because I'm a cheesy guy who likes the broad answers first, I was thinking that Twiggy could have an embarrassment meter, right? And maybe the game doesn't do anything like a game over screen or anything of that sort, but it does have the embarrassment number that goes down the less interactions there are, and all goes down when the choices are the choices that make Twiggy feel empowered. But if some of the choices are a little embarrassing for Twiggy, then that shows that agonism, agonism as a word, the core word from the word antagonist, right? That agonism of dealing with a world that might not always line up with Twiggy's worldview. And so again, my point being, not necessarily that this game needs a villain, just to put it in very clear terms, not at all. But I wonder if there is an opportunity to push a little harder on the agonistic aspects of these lived experiences, so that their subjectivity, their individuality, what they're standing for, right, becomes clear contrast. We can see them more clearly. What do you think about that? Is that something that is interesting to you?
So I definitely was thinking about it as people more bringing as well, like their own worldviews to it, in terms of when thinking about people with different learning disabilities or other disabilities coming for information. They are coming with whatever background they have from high school or middle school, and experience it, or even younger, like experience with teachers, experiences with peers, experiences with doctors, any sort of medical staff, and or like all that. Because I know those are some of the like worst things to deal with sometimes. Mm-hmm. And just that, like, even strangers on the street can be really misunderstanding of folks with disabilities. So a lot of people, I'm figuring, like, you are coming in with this idea of like what your comfort level is and what you think society expects of you. And sort of seeing that as the antagonist of sorts, where you're dealing with your side of that as well as what you're comfortable then in character, the character is doing. Which is why then, of course, like I tried not to have it be like, oh, you don't feel like saying you have ADHD to this teacher right now, like you're not going to be completely punished for it, because like you don't necessarily have to do that. But at the same time, the clarity does help them help you. So it's that line of like, where are you comfortable and then also showing in the characters that like Twiggy definitely had a more like embarrassed or anxious sort of feel to them, both in like in sort of like the way that they move and like the expressions that they had were definitely a lot more of that like tentative and like trying to feel things out aspect, which worked really well then for being that sort of first day where you're learning sort of the basics. Oliver seems to have more of like an attitude that's sort of about like pausing to like make those decisions, which makes sense with a sort of slow processing disorder, that like that's what you need to do really. So then trying to find those times where like, when are you making a decision in the moment really quickly, and where are you making decisions that are just like, oh, like, let me stop and think about this, and how much time you have and how you make use of that time, I guess. Which definitely like could be pushed more. It's something that like, that in my mind is what we wanted to go for. And especially like with Oliver's Day, like we were starting to come to the end of when the grant would be, and like for me, graduation and all that. So it became much more hectic to work, and is like, yeah, like it'd be nice to then like be able to push that a little bit more, or even just make it a little bit more clear with what's there in some ways.
Well, and keep in mind that all these conversations are mostly about finding out what are the insights and the discoveries and the personal voice that is coming through in this project, and that might be exploring further projects. So rather than being about correcting or changing or modifying what's happening here, because I think the game is strong, and I think that based on what I understand, especially based on the proposal, accomplished a lot. But what I really like about what's happening here just in this conversation is that we're starting to describe here a specific strategy. And maybe that sounds a little kind of mechanical, but a strategy of rewarding and exploring the social and emotional component of experience, right? Which becomes a way to think about the relationship between characters or specific problems and so on and so forth. So the relationship between characters and time, that is a source of agonism. The relationship between characters and internalized kind of notions of what's normal, like normativity, right? That is a beautiful source of agonism that I think a lot of us deal with, right? Like what are we expected to be versus who we want to be, and that inner struggle. That's and the fact that that you guys have found a way to explore that through those kind of subtle but very powerful interaction moments. Just something as simple as waiting a little more time, or having that shy face, which there's something just almost very fundamentally human about seeing a face looking back at you on the screen that is sad versus happy, right? That is a space of huge possibility, and it becomes a personal voice in a way, right? So that maybe this is one of the big insights to move forward with, regardless of your future projects, that you guys kind of landed on this ability to create subtle but very meaningful rewards and places of exploration without having to enter in those reductive spaces like good versus evil or win versus losing. And more importantly, thematically, I think that you've discovered, or you've seen in your game, how sometimes the agonism stems from normativity rather than one specific person, right? So like this societal expectations and whatnot, and the internal struggle to kind of comply or break away from them becomes an interesting theme. Does this make sense to you, what I'm saying here?
Yeah, so we were working then to like get it to the point where people were bringing in their own ideas, but also learning like how to recognize sort of what the characters themselves were going through.
That's great.
And like we initially too, like we were debating whether or not we wanted to do faces, where we were like, we kind of do, but like time-wise, will we have time for it? And we had like a first draft or so, like without the faces and just with text. And it was that sort of thing where like having that extra face there, and because like you're not rushed through dialogue, it's whenever you decide to hit space, you go to the next thing sort of thing, that like it helps people who need that time to stop and like read the dialogue, but also see the face to really register the like, oh, I can look at that. I can see Twiggy sort of looking to the side or like blushing, and process that like, yeah, that is like them being embarrassed, and like giving people the time they need to recognize that, so that it then gives them time to process the decisions that are being made. I think was really important to them, like, yeah, helping people understand and connect, as well as understand the education side of like, oh, like that's why this decision maybe isn't as great, because it's less clear, and it's maybe a little embarrassing, but also like doesn't help as much in the long run perhaps, or, oh, this is embarrassing, but it does help more in the long run. So where do I weigh out that worth?
Well, and what you're accomplishing with this too is one of the things that games do very well, and you know, educators know this almost instinctively, or can see this in the classroom, which is that when we play games, almost any kind of game, doesn't even have to be a game of, you know, with a specific educational goal, we combine logic and emotion together. That is one thing that happens in games that does not happen in other places. Like when I go for a job in my desk, I have to be very logical and respond logically. And sometimes when I go to the movies, or I'm relating with my family and my friends, I live this very emotional life. And of course, the separation of emotion and logic is a little problematic to begin with. But let's purport that at least a lot of a lot of the world claims that there is a separation. But it's hard not to be both things, logical and emotional, at the same time when you're playing a game. If you've ever played a very spicy game of like Monopoly, you know that it's such an emotional thing, you know, when someone is, you know, cheating you, or someone is winning and you're losing. But you're also thinking very logically, right? You're also trying to choose the right thing and the wrong, you know, what is the course of action. And that's what happens in this game too. And that's also why it has become part of the conversation about games and aesthetics. In terms of production, it's useful to see the different components as, of course, different. The art, the dialogue, the programming. But the space that, as a player, I'm occupying is a collection of everything. So to me, there is no difference between the dialogue and the faces. There might be discrepancies if they are like angling for different emotions or ideas, which is also interesting when it happens. But it's almost like I can hear Twiggy's voice when I'm reading the text, because I'm living in I'm entering this kind of virtual environment that you've created. And the fact that we have dialogue and images as separate components in production is not experienced like that by me when I'm playing the game. They all come together, and I'm kind of inhabiting both this logical and emotional space. So I think that's one of the strong arguments for why it's useful and valuable to put this type of experiences in the context of the game, because we're so ready. I think it's almost part of kind of the human contract. The moment we say, okay, let's play a game, the moment we say those words, we all are ready. Our brains go into this mode. We're like, okay, we're gonna solve a problem, but we're also gonna live here emotionally, and we're gonna let ourselves be swept by what's happening to us in our emotional experience. And that is, I think that's very successful in what's happening here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it definitely helped within that I was having like the 3 main playtesters involved, then like didn't really know coding. I don't know about Blythe specifically, but at least I know Anya hadn't worked on games before, and Meg, I think, expressed that like she hadn't worked much with making games in particular. So then like giving it to people as a like, here, just see this, play through it, and not having to then have them be the people that were like, oh, like, how is that working well, sort of thing. And when it glitched, not having to then have any of them really stop to think like, oh, why is that breaking, so much as just them being like, hey, this broke, so do you want it? And like I did have a couple friends that I was coding in Construct 3, so like they also have worked with that through classes, and it's relatively like a lot easier to learn than like C#. So like I could go to those people separately and be like, hey, like this is what my code looks like and something's not working, and they'd be able to help me, but then it wasn't really like contaminating the playtest group, I guess, where like at other times, like I've had playtesters that like one of my friends who also codes in Construct 3. So like one of the first things when something breaks is that like they'll start trying to fix it because they're on that sort of like programming mentality of like, okay, how do I fix? As opposed to just like, oh, from a player's experience, like it broke, or like this thing didn't quite work like I think it was supposed to, but I don't really know. So like, do you want to look at this? And it does make it a lot easier then to understand that when it was like just dialogue and people are like, it's missing something. Like, I think it needs the faces because it's missing something. And then after adding like some of the faces and like those sprites in, that then they were just like, yeah, like it feels much more like the characters. But not having it be in a way that then like they were more focused on how does it work, but just the like, does it work from a player understanding the dialogue side?
Absolutely.
So.
Well, we all are so hungry for narrative, and we're so hungry for characters, and we're so hungry for understanding ourselves in time, thanks to storytelling, right? So the aspect of interactivity and playfulness and making choices and exploring, it's only, in my opinion, enhanced by the fact that we're having this narrative space. Uh, as a layer of ideas, it will be worth a sketch or two, not necessarily something to even hard code, but just to kind of play out, systematizing some of the interactions a little bit more just to see what happens and what do you gain and what do you lose. So, the suggestion I had about an embarrassment meter, maybe that's too cheesy. As I said, I always come up with solutions that are a little too cheesy, so don't hear me out. But that direction as a sketch or an idea, just to see what will happen. What would you lose if you had a little bit more of those kind of very tangible, very expressed and clear means of either quantifying or systematizing or mechanizing, interaction. And then if it's too much, then step back. In that regard, another thing that I really kind of enjoy is the difference between, I really enjoy that part where Oliver has to write an email. That to me was very clever, insightful, and one of those ways in which you're expanding, through this work, you're expanding that spectrum that I described between no rewards at all, is very open-ended, and there is no right or wrong way of doing things, versus the game overs of the arcade games of the 80s. Because, we all have written emails, and we know that they carry a certain amount of stakes. If you don't want to say the wrong thing, emails are very challenging. I don't know if you guys could relate, but to me, writing an email can take me the whole day because I'm living in the moment trying to type, but I'm also living in the future. But I'm also remembering the past. What did I tell this person before? And so I'm not suggesting anything in particular other than that was a very interesting decision, and its mechanics. That is a very specific mechanic choice. And the fact that you were able to do that within the bounds of the text adventure, the multiple choice, coalescing those multiple choices with the characters, with the timer that is on the top, and all those different things. I mean, that's very insightful. I don't think I've seen that before, and definitely finding more ways to be pointed like that without necessarily again falling into good versus evil or anything like that. I think that's the thing that's spicy, and that I'm really looking forward to see what happens if you keep exploring. I think that was a really kind of beautiful gesture in the game.
If I remember, that one stemmed also from just like, we had a lot of like, go to this person's office and talk to them. And so I was thinking about like how realistically in college, like if you needed to tell your teacher something before a class, like a lot of us won't just like show up at the classroom. They're probably teaching. So then like, okay, like that email communication for things like this, but also things like, oh, I'm going to miss class, or I need help with this sort of thing. I need to meet with you at some point. And then also, yeah, the social and emotional intelligence sort of comes back into it as far as like email writing is not very easy. My mom's an English teacher, and she's proofread a lot of things for me over the years, mainly things that are like 4 sentences long, but I'm like, hey, is this horrible? And it's that same thing. And like, I think it also, especially for like folks with different things like anxiety and stuff, can become even more of like an all-day thing, as well as very tiring. So like having this example of like, oh, this is maybe how you could write that email, that even thinking back to it is like, so like breaking it down to like, what are the sort of 3 or 4 core sentences of like saying like, hi, this is who I am, but like, this is what I need. Can you help with this sort of, but also changing up wording within that, where it's like, depending on what your focus is, being more clear or less clear in that.
Oh, the struggle is real. English is not my first language. So when I have to write an email to like, for a grant or some client, oh my God, it could take me the whole day. Yeah. So you transported me right there. And to me, that also shows the path forward in terms of how to develop mechanics. I think that's something that, again, we're kind of designing, or not designing, but we're coming to grips with now that we are in the different paradigm of game design. We were moving away from those kind of very systematic and front-facing binary solutions, right? So if we're trying to create mechanics that are not about, press the button, kill the bad guy, what do we do? And I think that you've demonstrated, just based on what you say, that what we must do often is be observant. The fact is, if we pay attention, we live in games within games. Like our life is a collection of stylized behaviors, right? So, you know, people wouldn't describe, and I said this in the last time I was there, Montserrat, but people don't think about voting, for example, in a political election as a game, right? Because the stakes are too high. But if you were to compare voting with the alternative, right? You know, the way power was handed over or not handed over, but struggle between parties, you know, I don't know, 500 years ago, it's a sort of a game. We wouldn't describe it as a game. We may even call that a pejorative, pejorative to describe it as game, right? It's too important. But if we are sensitive and open to understand what are the behaviors around us that are somewhat stylized, that kind of move us away from that direct struggle, and that have become kind of means to deal with those kind of impulses or changes or challenges that we have every day, we start realizing that we do live in a world of mechanics. We are mechanized. You know, that sounds a little dry, but I just mean that we live in a world of stylization in many ways. So that is, to me, that's very insightful and very well observed. That is true, right? We could just go talk to a person in person, but we've come up with a way to, you know, deal with some of the distance problems and some of the emotional charge problems. And that observation is interesting and insight that here created a new mechanic. And now the question is, what are your eyes going to see next? What are the behaviors you're going to notice when you move through the world that could be understood in that systematic way and that can become new venues of exploration for those themes that matter to you, like, you know, inhabiting empathically these characters and the emotional and intelligent component of the stories that you're trying to tell. I think I'm excited to hear that, and I'm excited to witness that power of observation. Do you see what are you seeing right now? Now I'm curious, what are you seeing right now that people are doing that could be an interesting game or an interesting mechanic?
Well, I'm in rural New Hampshire, so most of the people I see are my family. But like the first thing that came to mind, at least with that, is like my friend that's staying with us just got a 7-month-old puppy that just got rehomed to them. And so like training their dog, even just like and the ways they're going through that, as far as both training it in terms of like when to reward it, when to be like, hey, no, you're not doing the right thing. But also like the recognition of, because it's a new dog, but also 7 months old, that like it's already got some of its own quirks that they're looking out for, and like its own anxiety as far as like it just got taken away from one family and brought to another person. So like learning how to recognize that definitely is like this weird line of, and that in itself kind of is a game as well, because like to the dog, at least you're just playing with it. Like it
Right.
just gets rewarded for some things and not others. So I guess it'll do those more. As well as like the interaction of like each of the animals with each other in general. I don't know how often you see goats, but if you watch goats, they do some of the craziest things, and trying to piece together why they do those things can take a long time.
That's beautiful, though. The fact you're paying attention to that you're observing that, to me, that means that hopefully one day you will integrate goat behavior into some AI.
We'll see.
Or that you will create some sort of rewards of cybernetic system that follows the logic of a puppy rather than the logic of a robot that is trying to kill you or something like that, right? And that will just engender interesting mechanics. And I think that game designers, who are sensitive and interested in exploring the world to what games can afford, are doing that. They're paying attention, they're being observant and trying to think about how we live in games within games. So, congratulations and a strong effort and a very beautiful theme, very insightful choices and gestures. I think that this sets you up to a lot of great choices and great opportunities coming forward. I can't wait to see what games, stem out of here. This is a great effort, and what comes, if the more awareness you have of the great things that you've done, and then you can use them as jumping up boards for what happens next, the better. Great things coming down, I think.
I do have to say too that in terms of like the social emotional education, that like I think there's big props to Anya for the designs that she did with those. That I think we had some of the dialogue set, but not all of it. So like I think we had some of Twiggy's, but not any of Oliver's really at the time when she was designing those faces. And she designed the characters and all that, and pretty much everything. Yeah, I gave her sizes, and she came back with gorgeous art.
Oh, it's beautiful. I know. No, great job.
Yeah, so like just the sort of social emotional intelligence of designing those and figuring out like, okay, like here's a good array of like, I think there were 6 or 7 for each character of each of their emotions, that then I was sort of lining it up with dialogue. But for her from the start, like bringing those designs really helped it make it like easier for me to then make those connections for things.
Oh, character design is like mediating between people, right? And what individuals look like and so on. So that makes a lot of sense. You know, kudos and props to Matt, props for her, because you guys have really kind of fleshed out these characters that, as I said, when I was playing the game, I was not looking at collections of bits and pieces or mechanics, but really letting myself be taken by kind of the emotional reality you guys created. So I'm looking forward to see what happens, in the future. Just great stuff coming. I really believe it.
Thank you.
Well, thanks to you. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. That was a fascinating conversation.
Awesome.
And Abe, Meg, unfortunately, I gave the link a little bit too late, but I just want to introduce you to Meg Grant, who works so closely with Dorian and Anya.
Nice to meet you, Meg.
Nice to meet you as well.
Meg, did you want to add anything about LDFA or working with them at all? Or
Sure. So this project kind of came from Blythe and I working together to write a grant proposal that was put out for the LDFA, which is Learning Disability Foundation of America. They're out of Pittsburgh. Their goal is really just educate about learning disabilities. So they wanted some kind of project or research that could be widely distributed to help educate people about learning disabilities. Learning disabilities oftentimes are considered hidden disabilities because it's not a physical thing all the time. So the more awareness we bring, the less stigma. And they've been really great to work with. It was definitely interesting doing this during a global pandemic, but we did it. I mean, we had 2 different projects for interns. They had to apply just like they did a job, cover letter, resume. We did interviews. And Dorian and Anya did this amazing game. And then our other 2 interns did an animation, both the theme being advocacy. And I just couldn't be happier with both projects. Excellent.
It's a great cause, is a great theme. I think the results speaks for themselves. Good for all of you to for participating and working on this. I think is very exciting to see. Absolutely.